Welcome back to the program. We are here with Dr. Gordon Hahn, who's a prolific author and an expert on Russia-America relations, as well as the Caucasus. Now, thank you for coming on the program. I read one of your articles on Europe's suicidal follies, and I thought this could be a good starting point for a talk.
Thanks for inviting me.
So, I get this, I get the same sentiment whenever I travel around the world. There's this confusion about the direction of Europe these days because, I'm always asked why are you Europeans escalating a war and boycotting a diplomacy when you're losing that war and risking nuclear war? In the economic sphere as well, it's the same question. That is why the bizarre economic policies that are undermining the economic power of the continent. And also, why can't Europe's leaders see that a crisis of political legitimacy is growing and there's very little course correction? And I often make the point, I very much understand what the Ukrainians are doing, the Russians, the Americans, the Europeans, though. It is a bit of a conundrum. So I thought, yeah, if you can outline the ideas in your article and also why you describe Europe's behavior as suicidal.
Yeah. Well, basically, the article, in my view, a little bit overemphasizes the personal. And on the one sense, I think that it stands to be correct that indeed these people are somewhat narcissistic and and spoiled to a certain extent, and they're also cut off from the general population. But another aspect, I think, is that they're highly ideologized. In other words, they're sort of radical idealists. They're not really, in any true sense, realists. Plus, if you add in the, defining realists, in the Mearsheimer, in the way that John Mearsheimer eloquently and you often eloquently discuss it, right? Is we're talking about, a realist approach to the international politics would be one in which you realize that um, conflict is inherent in the system because it's an anarchic system. There's no overriding governing process, and so there's an element, as John Mearsheimer always stresses, a tragic sort of permanent state of conflict in which a security dilemma is either between great powers or between states is always on the edge to about to occur or not to occur. These people don't operate under this assumption. They operate under an ideological assumption as idealists, in which they believe, especially if we're talking about Europe, right, that they are sort of that the European Union is a manifestation of the democratic dream, the democratic hope that would lead to a sort of perpetual peace around the world. Therefore, you have this whole idea of the democratic peace, right, where democratic states don't get into conflict with each other. Only democratic states only get into conflict with authoritarian states, and of course, that's the fault of the authoritarians. Is never never the fault of the democratic or Republican states. I should emphasize, by the way, that I don't like to use the word democratic because democracies don't exist, maybe except maybe in a few cantons in Switzerland. I mean, generally, we're talking about republics. So uh, this sort of leads to a sort of a demagogy and an idea that sort of a Bolshevik idea, right? A Bolshevik, you might call it Bolshevik republicanism, in which these people are willing to undertake any means in order to achieve their ends of building a republican world, which they see as an inevitable outcome sooner or later. So, in terms of policy, the odd thing is that there are numerous contradictions. Some of the contradictions are built into the structure of the EU, not just the impracticality of these ideologues, but the fact that there's a sort of a split sovereignty. There's sort of like the idea of plurinationalism in national identity, right? So if you're someone who lives in, I don't know, Bavaria, and you self-identify as both Bavarian, German, and European. Well, the same problem here comes up in the European Union in terms in relation to sovereignty, right? That leaders and states have a split sovereignty between that to the EU and then that to their own national state. And over the course, especially in this era of the globalists, um, the sovereignty of the state has been sacrificed to the sovereignty of the EU. And so you have all sorts of contradictions in policy, right? On the one hand, and NATO, by the way, I should add it. That's crucial, right? Is NATO. So you have all sorts of strange contradictions, right? You have, for example, France, uh, uh, on the one hand, still buying oil from Russia and importing natural gas. They're buying the oil through India and Turkey. LNG, they switched to LNG gas, to their American LNG gas to the extent possible. And this is being done at the cost of paying higher prices for gas and for the oil, which is marked up by India and Turkey for resale. So at the same time, you're taking this economic hit for this and simultaneously threatening Russia. So on the one hand, you're financing to extend exact. Granted, Europe has cut 90% of its purchase of Russian energy, but there's still some money going towards the purchase of Russian energy. And at the same time, the French are sort of in the vanguard of threatening escalations and actually undertaking small steps of but dangerous escalation. For example, when they boarded one of the ships that supposedly was transporting, I believe, it was oil. One of those what do they call it? Dark fleet, shadow fleet ships. They've talked about sending troops. Macron's been very forward in forming the coalition, the willing, and he talked about sending troops as part of a security guarantee. A French general recently stated that they were prepared already to do that. The Russian SVR, the Foreign Intelligence Service, claims that there are already troops in Odessa, French troops in Odessa. And more recently, about a week ago, they claimed that there are about 2,000 mostly Latino French Foreign Legion troops training in Poland, ready to be deployed to perhaps either Odessa and or under the security guarantees plan, which hasn't been undertaken. So you have this contradiction. On the one hand, you're financing the Russians, and on the other hand, you're ready to go to war with the Russians, ostensibly. Another issue here is of this sort of this idea of sort of divided sovereignty is the whole issue of that's been raised of taking the Russian assets that have been frozen, 300 million euros in Russian assets, and using it to help finance assistance to Ukraine. And this is run up against that basically was an EU plan of sorts, and it basically ran up against Belgium. That is the interests of the nation state of Belgium, where Euroclear, which houses either all or part of those funds, is based in Belgium, and should the confiscation of those assets, or regardless of the pretext, whether it's through a loan and collateral, euro bonds, whatever, should there be a lawsuit, then Euroclear could clearly suffer, and that would have implications for the Belgian economy. And so the Belgian prime minister came out and said, "Well, we're perfectly happy to be part of the coalition of the willing, but we also want to be part of the coalition of the billing." That is, they don't want to be the only ones to be footing the bill for this problem should a lawsuit emerge and they end up losing the lawsuit. So again, you have this contradiction between, state sovereignty and European sovereignty and NATO goals, essentially, which is to level a strategic defeat against Russia no matter what, so they can continue to expand NATO. That's the whole purpose of the NATO-Russia. That's why I call this thing the NATO-Russia-Ukrainian war. It's not so much a Ukrainian war as a NATO-Russian war.
It's I think you were spot on with the ideology and narcissism, but you can kind of see the reason behind this, though, because again, the narrative of the European project it's very much defined the thinking of the political elites. That is, after the Second World War, we've had the centuries of Europeans killing each other in the Great Wars, and then suddenly instead we formed this coal and steel to have transparency and economic cooperation to establish peace. Effectively transcending history itself is the kind of narrative that for the first time the Europeans are able to properly work with each other. And then, of course, after the Cold War, this mission is to be brought not just to wider Europe, but indeed the European experience should be shared with the world, with the genuine assumption that Europe has now the secret formula to essentially transform the world. And the EU itself was seen almost as the embodiment of Francis Fukuyama's end of history thesis. So this was kind of the predictions and the logic and the self-image which was seen for the European elites. Now, these are all very attractive theories. This is the same as why in political science we seem to have often a bias towards liberal theories among political leaderships, because it is more appealing to think that you can transform the world as opposed to accepting that some of these problems can't be transcended. And for academics, we saw not just the late 90s, but throughout the 2000s, the main discussions around Europe was, is the EU a normative power that spreads, changes the world through its norms? Is it a civilian power? Is it an ethical power? Or is it best defined as a moral power? And we have, vast amount of articles and books which students had to read as well and study, all organized more or less around the question: what makes Europe so unique and great? How did we, fix history essentially? And so when this bubble begins to pop and you realize that, a lot of this wasn't really being achieved. It's normal, I guess, for the elites to withdraw a little bit away from the general public, where the realities of the world are actually establishing themselves, and they instead retreat in Brussels, where they still pretend as if the project is still going. And indeed, Russia is seen as the key threat to this project, and even debates about the conflict we have with Russia, on a normal level, seems to undermine the narrative which the EU has based itself upon. So it's almost existential to continue to stick their heads in the sand. I don't know. I find it to be quite extraordinary, because you can say that there's two different, well, don't oversimplify, but it's two major ways of looking at, for example, this war now in Ukraine. That is, one, you will have the argument, which the EU likes, that the Russians are just expansionists. They want to restore the Soviet Union. And to prevent this, again, the EU having this massive historical mission to change the world, it's upon us in Europe to arm Ukraine and ensure that the costs are too high and make sure Russia can't get away with it. And it also makes sense to some extent. You want to heighten the cost versus the benefits of any military opportunism. But there is a second theory, which, as you suggested, that people like Mersheimer and other realists have put forth, which rests on a mountain of evidence, which is that Russia fears NATO expansion. It's not just fearing it, it sees it as an existential threat, which is why it intervened in Ukraine. Now, if this is true, any military escalation will just be met with further escalation on the Russian side, and the result will not be peace. It will be the complete destruction of Ukraine and possibly nuclear war with the NATO countries. So, I tend to lean towards the second. Not tend, I'm very convinced it's the second, but I can admit I might be wrong. However, what is extraordinary in Europe, it is completely impossible to have anything that resembles a discussion. It's either you go with the first theory or you're with the Russians, you're a Putinist. And I'm not sure if this leans into the constructivist ideals in the EU, where you think that speech forms social reality. That is, if you say that the Russians have a legitimate fear, then you might legitimize their actions and you delegitimize the entire policies of the EU and the European project of all over. So you're essentially a traitor. It doesn't matter if it's real or not, or if you're correct, but merely arguing this, you create a social reality which undermines the European project. So it's it's a very hard puzzle to solve in Europe, because if you're not allowed to talk about these issues, anyone is a traitor who questions it. Where can you go? There's no, there's no course correction. Anyway, sorry, that was a very long comment,
Well,
but
I think
sorry.
but I think you're absolutely right. And the irony of the situation is that, on the one hand, they're dedicated to this project of spreading republicanism across the world and freedom of speech and all these other values, which, by the way, in Europe, freedom of speech has never been really, it's certainly not constitutionalized in many countries. Um, and say, and now during this war, it's actually taking a large hit in many European countries. So you have this irony, right? On the one hand, where Europe is involved in this great project of spreading republicanism across the globe, along with the United States, and on the other hand, in order to achieve this goal, they're crushing freedom of speech, the elements of a Republican that are so vital to a Republican system. And at the same time, they're ignoring the devolution, I guess you could say, of Ukraine from a weak, being a weak Republican system to one that is a weak authoritarian system, and this has to be covered up. And again, it gets back to what you were talking about. Um, this can't be spoken about. Only it will only begin to be spoken about when people are getting ready to abandon Ukraine and Zelensky. And we've seen that happening over the last month or so, or maybe especially in the last week. So here we find out that actually the idealism isn't so isn't so idealistic, right? And in reality, they're willing to sacrifice their ideals in order to achieve these goals. Of course, we have a much more bigger we have a larger problem, right? That in term of fact, in terms of trying to discern to the extent to which ideals, that is, the ideal of republicanism, really drives things. Because, of course, along with expanding NATO, you expand the sphere in which the Western military industrial complex can sell its weapons, and you can do other sorts of business, and you take business away from Russia. So, in fact, there's kind of there's a tension in the whole system, and that breaks out the reality of realism is breaking out in the process of trying to implement this, right? Because you see the Belgians resisting the risk of um, compromising Euroclear, the French, financing the Russians while they're fighting the Russians, while they're calling for an escalation against the Russians. So it's all, it's very murky, and one wonders, I have a hard time discerning which plays a greater role. Is it the ideology, or is it the economic factors that are driving this NATO expansion, for example? Um, it's obviously some kind of a combination, but their attempt to deny that, realism actually exists has led them to bump up against realism in another country where idealism just died, and that's Russia, right? The idea, so a single-minded devotion to a particular ideology disappeared in Russia, and they became sort of hyper realists. You might even say, in some ways, in some cases, rather cynical realists, but realists nonetheless. Um, and they were sure to be very careful about having the world's most powerful military alliance spread all along across its western borders. And that's not just a realness issue, by the way. I would like to add it, sort of an addendum to the Mearsheimer realist approach, is that, I mean, the Russians. Look at China. China is basically, if you look at realism, tends to focus more on capability, than intentions to a certain extent. So if you look at China, I mean, China's capabilities in terms of military power and economic power and so forth are, probably approaching, if not exceeding, Europe's. Um, Maybe not NATO's, because that includes the United States, but they're certainly approaching the power of NATO, and there will be over the next few decades. So there is a realist reason for Russians to be a little leery of China, but in reality, we don't see all that much leeriness, if that's a word. And I think one reason is because of there is not a long history of conflict with China that is created within Russian political culture and Russian strategic culture an intense wariness of the West. And so, even in the heydays of perestroika and the arms control agreements, and even post perestroika under Yeltsin, um, when there was even talk about Russia joining NATO, there was always a large portion of the population that was very suspicious of this, um, because of this sort of what I call a security vigilance culture. And that sort of intensifies the realist element. You take these two things together, the realist concern about the geostrategic, geopolitical position of having NATO along the borders, plus the historical pattern uh, of Russian threats to Russia emanating from the West, and Ukraine here is crucial, right? Because you look at the three touchstone moments in Russian history that they tend to focus on in terms of the eternal Russian threat. Perhaps you could look at a Western threat. You could perhaps look at it that way. Is the Polish-backed invasion during the Smuta, during the time of troubles in the early 17th century. Then during during Hitler, right? Hitler's main invasion route, one of the main invasion routes was through Ukraine. One went to St. Petersburg, one headed towards Moscow, and one went to Kiev. The Polish Smuta invasion also went through Kiev, and the false Dmitri, who through a small army was organized by the Poles, gathered force as he went up through Ukraine towards and then into Russia, towards Russia proper, and then towards Moscow. Gathered Cossack and criminal oriented bands, and then also some Russian patriots who believed that he was the legitimate successor to the throne. So, and then the other key event is the Napoleonic invasion, which occurred through Belarus, what is today Belarus, which is next to Ukraine, and which the West has also focused on in trying to foment color revolutions. So, um, and all these episodes in history, if you go to Russia anytime, you watch any Russian TV through on the internet. You go to a Russian ballet, you go to Russian operas, and you'll constantly run into this theme of the Smuta, and the military threat that emanates from the West. And then this also redounded then to domestic politics, because at the same time there was an external threat, military threat. This was also often coupled throughout Russian history by the Western powers who were trying to influence Russia, shape Russia, undermine Russia, making whether it was in the in the 18th century, in which Western powers allied with elements inside the Winter Palace to engineer and influence succession struggles. Whether it was the Germans financing Lenin prior to, and other revolutionaries prior to the revolution, and then during in the months leading up to the Bolshevik coup, whether it was the Vatican, at least morally supported, and certainly at the lower level, at the level of the Catholic Church in Poland, raising money to support the false Dimitri's army that went into Russia through Ukraine. This has led to a sort of having a security vigilance culture inside the country, and so when relations with the West are bad, there's a tendency to harden the domestic regime. And so often, what happens, and we saw this again in the 1990s and 2000s. Well, at one point, on the one hand, we're trying to push a more liberal regime in Russia, and that becomes sort of a very major goal. And again, it's tied to this whole European project we've been talking about, spreading the republicanism across the globe. And at the same time, we overstep and we take some kind of military military political step, such as expanding NATO. And so this immediately raises the red flag inside in Russia about the potential for domestic disturbances fomented by the West. So you have this circular process, right, of Russia moving away from the West, then moving back to the West, some kind of a democratization, liberalization, republicanization, whatever you want to call it, begins to occur. But then the elements in the West use that to either take advantage of the West, of Russia, or take steps that militarily, geopolitically threaten Russian national security or national interests, and then there's a conflict, and then they sort of they close in again. They go back to sort of the original authoritarian, autocratic state, whatever, depending on the era, whatever term you want to use, and then the whole process it begins again. We've gone like through 3 or 4 cycles of this, and it tends to repeat itself. And clearly, there's a problem here between, and a lot of this has to do with, and of course, on the other side of the coin, there's sort of a cultural effect of all this in the West, and that is this basically a cultural Russophobia that the Russians are incapable of democracy when it's failing, when liberalization is failing, or there's a conflict. Well, then the Russians are culturally incapable of democracy. They're inherently authoritarian. It's in the Russian genes. Therefore, we have to put up a wall and secure ourselves against the Russian bear, who's any moment's going to come across and try to spread their authoritarian view. And it's a sort of a mirror imaging. Instead of the Europeans in the West trying to push democracy and liberalism on Russia, it's actually the Russians who are just breaking at the seams to spread authoritarian regime and take control of the West. So it's a sort of kind of silly, really, mirror imaging, and it's a result. It's sort of fallback position, default position. If you're unwilling to recognize that Russia has legit, no matter what kind of regime they have, an authoritarian liberal regime, they're going to have their own national interests, and because of at least history, and if not just practical military terms, they're not going to want to have a major military alliance strewn across its western border. I think it was George Shultz who once said that countries build their national security in classic realist formulation. In a classic realist formulation, stated that that countries build their security and foreign policies not on the basis of intentions, but on the basis of capabilities. So the West could, as they did throughout as the NATO expansion process began, saying, "Well, we're not targeting Russia. We're simply trying to expand the democratic sphere and bring in other countries that are a part of the West into the Western security and political and economic architecture, and so forth and so on." And this has nothing to do with Russia, so with the targeting Russia, so Russia shouldn't feel any kind of threat from this. But this is clearly absurd. I used to tell my students way back when I was teaching 15, 20 years ago in the United States, I would tell them, just imagine if there was if the Soviet Union or Russia somehow without the Soviet Union had won the Cold War, and they somehow had formed an alliance in Latin America, a security alliance in Latin America, and maybe even in Europe, and Russia and the United States was not part of this security alliance. And then there was a coup in Canada. Oh, I mean Ukraine. I mean Canada, right? And there was a coup in Canada, and it brought to power some French-speaking Canadians who didn't like English speakers, right? What would the reaction be of the United States government? Oh, there'd be 200,000 troops in Ottawa within 2 weeks. That would have been the reaction. So I don't know what people seriously, why you run across people like, well, again, it's a classic expression. I read I think it was a tweet or something where it was a video in which Michael McFaul, the former U.S. ambassador to Moscow and national security advisor to Obama, made the statement. It's not what, and he's made this statement many, many times, but he's making it again, right? That Putin's not afraid, and he always personalizes it. It's Putin. It's not Russia. Well, if you just talk about Putin, then you can ignore all these historical, cultural factors, which he has very weak knowledge of. because he doesn't take them seriously, and geostrategic and political factors, and just focus on the personality. And well, if Putin wasn't such a bad guy, then we wouldn't be having these problems. And the fact is that Putin is afraid not of NATO expansion, but he's afraid of democracy. And this entirely ignores the fact that Russia has very good relations with India, the world's largest democracy. India is India is a member of BRICS, very close to Russia in recent years. Russia has good relations with Hungary because Hungary is not high on this war. Better relations with Slovakia. Good relations with Serbia because these countries are not, even though they're NATO members and they're democratic states, but they're not high on this NATO-Russia-Ukrainian war. So this is kind of a myth that the Russians can't get along with democratic countries. No, what they can't get along with is having a major military alliance along its western border. That's what they can't get along with.
You can put Mongolia into that category because
Mongolia too, yeah.
they're democratizing quite nicely, and they are
Yes.
landlocked country wedged between China and Russia. And so this ideology of ours would suggest that the Chinese and Russians, they hate democracy and fear it so much they would seek to crush it. But
Right.
but neither the Chinese nor the Russians seem to mind at all the democratic reforms taking place there. So again, I think the secret variable we can't discuss would be perhaps it is the largest NATO, largest military bloc, which is NATO, which could be one of the consequences. But I think this also goes back to what you started off saying with this self-delusion, and this is
Right.
if we kind of defined NATO as a force for good, because this was kind of the condition for the hegemony being great for everyone, to be a benign hegemon. So NATO's a force for good. So even through the 2000s and beyond, the whole idea that, well, would Russia fear NATO? Well, that's absurd. This is, obviously we're a force for good. We just bring stability along its borders. But NATO always had this very strange efforts, though, where it has to do two things at once. On one hand, it saw a mission in deterring Russia. At the same time, it had to reassure Russia that NATO's not here for you. And sometimes you would see this balance clash live. That is, obviously in the 90s, we had more honest debates about the consequence of NATO expansion before the decision had been made. But once one spoke about NATO expansion, the argument was, well, it's not really a threat to Russia. It's a peaceful, liberal, democratic bloc. Fukuyama's dream. But at the same time, if the question was put forth, well, what if it alienates Russia and it will strengthen nationalist forces? Well, then you have people like Madeleine Albright saying, well, then NATO's there. We have Russia more or less surrounded. So you want to have it both ways. That is, NATO's not targeted against Russia, nothing to fear. But if something happens, then we have NATO, the insurance policy, which is ready to go after Russia. And, no matter what position one takes on the Ukraine war, surely one has to recognize some of the concerns of Russia in the past, because we said NATO would never be used against Russia, but we are pumping everything we have now into this war to push for the strategic defeat of Russia. Surely, yeah, we can say, well, Russia shouldn't have invaded Ukraine. Fair enough, but still, NATO is there in the security competition. You now have a massive military bloc. So, but still, there's no admission, though, that perhaps this was concern. Just on something you said about on the topic of Europe believing it transcended its history. I find it interesting because you went through some of this history, and for the Russians, they see it very differently, though. I get the impression they see a much more historical continuity. That is, if you look at Ukraine, for example, when the Germans were in war with the Russians in World War One, they ended this with the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. And this was framed in Germany as a way of liberating the Eastern Slavs from the rule of Russia. But I guess every single historian more or less agree that this was more or less a cover, not to liberate them from Russia, but to replace Russian dominance with German dominance. And so again, that was in First World War, and then the Second World War, you had the same revival of the same rhetoric, that is, we will liberate people from Russian hands, but again, it would fall under German dominance. And you saw now for the third time from 2013 and 14, we're here to help Ukraine to free it from Russian dominance. And all these facts were ignored, such as that the majority didn't want a coup. When the Ukrainians themselves suggested in 2013, let's do a trilateral agreement. Again, we won't be dominated by Russia, but we'll have a foot in both camps. Like, no, the EU was very explicit. You have to be, under the EU. So I don't know. I just don't see. I can understand the Russian concerns in terms of why they're not buying into this idea that we're just looking to help Ukraine. I think there's a lot of evidence now that indeed, if you hear the NATO officials talking now as well as EU, they see the Ukrainians as essentially a big shield. If they can put them into the NATO orbit under our control, then they can be used against Russia. So I don't know. I think the historical continuity is quite obvious. But how do you make sense though of the reluctance to now engage in diplomacy with the Russians, though? Because this is a bit of a break from the EU. If you go to the core of the EU identity, the main idea was, we don't send weapons to countries at war. And also, the first thing you do when there's conflicts, I mean, anywhere in the world, the EU logic is at least sit down and begin to talk. This is the first step towards resolving any conflict. This time around, though, the EU foreign policy chief, the former one, at least Borrell, said this will be resolved on the battlefield. And for the past 3.5 years, we're more or less boycotted diplomacy. How do you see this fitting into the to the wider logic of the EU?
So there are a lot of in NATO, and there are a lot of ironies here too, because basically what this is a reflection of, in my view, is the loss of sovereignty in Europe, the subordination of Europe to the interests of the United States. So the United States is willing to engage in more brinkmanship up to a point, because they're more distant from the front line, so to speak, when there's not a in this case, we have a real front line in the Ukrainian war. But in general, between Europe and between NATO and non-NATO, between the EU and non-EU countries. So there's an irony here. On the one hand, they're giving up their sovereignty to subordinate themselves to the United States. On the other hand, they're giving up their sovereignty. The nation states of the EU and NATO are giving up their sovereignty to these larger international organizations that sort of typify the so-called democratic community. But at the same time, these organizations are badly split. You have if you just look at the defense spending, according to the NATO principle, everyone is supposed to spend 2% of their GDP on military matters. And you look at the top 6 spenders, and it's Poland, the Baltic states, and Finland, and then Greece. 5 of them border Russia, so one can understand that they have a sort of realist interest in increasing, in meeting that standard. The only ones that spend more than 2%. The other one, Greece, is spending that money simply because to protect itself from Turkey and make it more likely that there would be some kind of Article 5 action if something happened in Cyprus. So, again, you see being closer to the borders, again, is a manifestation of a realist thinking, right? The closer we are to the Russian border and the potential threat, the more we're willing to sacrifice ourselves financially in order to bolster NATO for any future problem. On the other hand, the United States is a distant great power, and they don't really need, when push comes to shove, the eternal question, will Washington be willing to sacrifice, New York to protect, or risk New York to protect Warsaw, to protect Riga, to protect uh, Tallinn? And so it's a very, it's a very complicated calculus that may not work well. And so essentially, what happened here was everybody, the United States and Europe, rather than functioning as realist powers, they were sort of hooked into their own, self-deluded by their own demagogy about democratization. And so they put Ukraine up as sort of a sacrificial lamb, right? They pushed Ukraine into the arms of the Russian bear by organizing a coup. Uh, then after the coup, um, supporting the Kiev civil war against the largely Russian-speaking Donbass. Um, then using the Minsk agreement as sort of a cover to rearming, stationing 14 CIA centers along the borders with Russia, uh, then allowing the Ukrainians to move troops close to the Russian border, refusing to discuss the idea of cruise missiles being stationed refusing to agree not to station cruise missiles in Ukraine, and all these sorts of things, basically provoking the Russians. And this is, of course, why there's this constant repetition, this mantra in the Western media. Every time they mention the war, they talk about Putin's unprovoked war. Putin's unprovoked war. And this is repeated constantly because, in fact, these media outlets know the war, in fact, was provoked. So to cover that, they have to keep talking about this unprovoked war. Um, and the other aspect here is that with the expansion of NATO further, closer to the Russian borders, where countries were situated and in the past, therefore, had past conflicts with Russia, regardless of whose fault it was, right? Poland has had conflicts with Russia. There were, four partitions of Poland. What's often forgotten is when they talk about Russia partitioning Poland, is that European powers joined in the partition of Poland, Austria, Hungary, and so forth. So this just wasn't a Russian operation. Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania also have, some reasons to be leery of Russian power. Finland, although lesser so, because they seem to have gotten over this issue even during the Cold War. So once these countries became members of NATO, the four Baltic states and Poland before the Ukrainian war, Finland after the Ukrainian war, along with Sweden, they tend to drive this Russophobic element that exists in Western Germany, but sometimes remains, more underground than it is in Eastern Europe and in Eastern Europe. And so they tend to tip the scales in favor of greater Russophobia inside the EU, inside NATO, which also helped to provoke this conflict. And now you see this dynamic, reaching its apex with, Kallas being the foreign minister in the EU and, other things. So it's, again, it's a very a conflictive situation that can only be resolved by, taking all countries taking into account the other side's interests. And at this point, the West is just completely unwilling to do that. And part of that has to do with the degradation of democracy in our own backyard.
Yeah, but still, I think in the US there's some more pragmatism because I can understand the American position. That is from 2014. You saw this decision being made. Let's use the Ukrainians to weaken Russia, as you said. And this has been, of course, confirmed in the New York Times and other media that from the first day after the coup, the CIA established a partnership with the intelligence service of Ukraine to use them as a tool against Russia, and they even had to rebuild it from scratch, given that the Ukrainian intelligence services worked with Russia, and indeed
Right.
they were favorable towards them. So it was very obvious that this was the objective from day one, long before Russia intervened in any way. And this is also why the US was opposed to implementing the Minsk agreement, because the point wasn't to end the conflict, it was to build up a Ukrainian proxy and keep the hostilities going. And this has been confirmed by numerous US leaders as well, from Romney to Keith Kellogg, but nonetheless, you see this American pragmatism, though. When the bet has been lost, or the war has been lost, you see some adjustment to reality. That is, transfer both the responsibility as well as the consequences to the Europeans, get more distance, and again, Trump's selling himself as a peacemaker who just couldn't get it done. So, this is quite rational. I can understand why this is the approach they're taking. I would probably have advised the same in terms of distancing themselves from a failed war. But in Europe, I was waiting, when you see the war ending, I was expecting to see a shift in narrative. Arestovich, the former advisor of Zelensky, made this point, like, we've been having this massive propaganda campaign for so long, but we can't pretend as if we're still winning when all the facts are coming. Here, we have to start to change the narrative now, so the public gets used to the idea that things aren't going this way. Well, in Europe, this is not happening at all. We're still going with this rhetoric that it was unprovoked. Putin is still Hitler. Russia still wants to restore the Soviet Union. Well, if this is the narrative, if the adversary has no legitimate interests or concerns, and it's just pure evil, it's not possible to have any compromise. So there's nothing being done. We're really going to go down with the ship on this one, I think. And there was an interesting interview, a press conference recently now with Orban and Trump. And Orban sits next to Trump. He makes the point, listen, the Europeans, usually they would be just send some humanitarian aid. It was Biden who got them all riled up and committed to fighting Russia till the end. And we have to bring an end to this. So I think it's very much correct. I just don't know. I see no correction on the European side, and this is what makes no sense at all. Indeed, I had a debate in this country, in Norway, with the former foreign minister, and she, any fact that went against the narrative was just met with screeching that this is you accepted the Russian propaganda. So if I said, well, majority of Ukrainians, they want talks to Russia, why are we boycotting diplomacy? And this is according to Gallup, but Gallup is not a credible source. I mean, this is one of the largest polling organizations. It's American. I never heard anyone challenge its credibility. I made the point. Well, even the American side, Trump, at least on 2 occasions, have now said that NATO provoked the war. You can do a quick search. You'll find him speaking about this on YouTube. No, he's never made such a comment. It's all fake. I mean, it's complete and total withdrawal from reality just to protect the narrative from any harmful facts. It's quite sad to watch. Just my last question, though. How do you see, in terms of, because you did mention the dependency on the United States, how important do you think this is in terms of explaining some of the let's call it the decline or suicidal behavior of the Europeans? Because 20 years ago there was almost parity between the EU and the US in economic power. The EU leaders only spoke about the sovereign, they called it strategic sovereignty and European independence, which is EU talk for more independence from the United States. But what we're seeing today, though, is dependence and vassal behavior to an extent which Macron had warned against for years. How do you read this dependence in terms of explaining some of the policies of the Europeans?
Well, first, kind of go back to your previous statement, because I think there's some important things that could be said there. First, I think there is an element of self-delusion, but that self-delusion spreads beyond the elite. So they've created a political problem for themselves domestically. That is, they've been issuing this propaganda about Russia is going to conquer Europe, it seeks to conquer Europe. So if Putin wants to recreate the Russian Empire, and now this is believed in certain parts of the population. There are other parts of the population that understand that this is being said for political purposes, and they'll either go along with it because they're politicized, or or not. So they sort of created an atmosphere in Europe that that they need to now basically comply with. Um, the other aspect is that they've invested so much, they've sunk so much money into this Ukraine project that then to lose it, they risk falling from power. So they're basically trying to avoid what happened in the United States. Americans, for other reasons, but also because of the Ukraine war, um, voted for Trump, and the European leadership is basically sort of the same as the Biden administration. There were no particular conflicts between either in terms of domestic politics or foreign policy between the way the Biden administration functioned and the way European leaders tend to function. So they see Trump as sort of the handwriting on the wall, and therefore Trump has to be uh, peace has to be avoided because Trump is supporting peace, and Trump has to be defeated because it has domestic uh, problems, implications for us. The other issue is, I think one reason is that they're so attached to defense on the cheap, right? Through NATO, most of these countries, as I mentioned earlier, are not paying the 2%. Um, the United States provides most of the nuclear cover. And so on that basis, the Europeans have been able to sit very comfortably and build large, uh, socialist oriented um, economies and states that keep the population minimally satisfied. The other problem, but now that problem is aggravated by the fact that they've allowed all these immigrants to come in, which costs the state more money to cover certain costs and certain problems. So they need this. They need Uncle Sam. They need the Big Daddy there in the United States to keep um, funding their military defense. And the only way to do that is to win the Ukrainian war, because if the Ukrainian war is lost, then there's a danger that the United States will forever abandon the European politics. And that's, of course, all this is linked in again to defeating Trump and making sure that there's no successor to Trump that is who thinks along his lines, or the lines that he used to think. He may be still thinking, according to Witkoff. There's still hard talk going on, so we'll see. But so it's a complex mix of in this case, some self-interest, and then that they're living off Uncle Sam, as long as Uncle Sam will allow it. But on the other hand, they've deluded themselves and their own populations through this propaganda about the need to spread republicanism throughout the world and defeat those nasty authoritarians there in Moscow, so the process can continue. So it's again, multi-factor explanation to all this process.
Yeah. Well, thanks for taking the time to speak with me today. It's and pick your brain. Where can people find your work?
On my site at either gordonhahn.com or on my Substack, which is Considering Russia and Eurasia. And I publish articles on different subjects, from Russian and Eurasian politics to Russian culture to U.S.-Russian relations and so forth.
Well, I'll leave a link to it in the description. So thanks again, and yeah, have a good one.
Okay, thank you for inviting me. Take care, Glenn.